Welcome to the Proceedings podcast. I'm Bill Hamblet, the editor-in-chief of Proceedings at the Naval Institute. Today is Tuesday, March 7th, and we're going to be talking about the March issue of Proceedings, the annual Naval Review. Good to have you on board, everybody. And I'll go to my guests now. Today, Bill Bray, the deputy editor-in-chief of Proceedings, and Brian O'Rourke, the senior editor of Proceedings. Brian, Bill, welcome back.
Thanks. Great to be here, Bill.
Yeah, great to be here.
So the March issue's out. It's got a great picture of a Marine aviator on the cover, air crewman from MV-22 Osprey unit. Cool shot. And I mentioned in my editor's page that one of the best changes we've made in the last couple of years is that we used to do the annual review or the Naval Review in May, which is kind of a long time after the previous year that we were reviewing ended, and now we do it in March. And so, it's great to still have 2022 sort of fresh in the rearview mirror and look back on it. And we're also, it's a little bit of a big ask for the review section authors to say, okay, by the end of December, they're like starting to wrap it up and put it into text so that we have it in early January, because the March issue goes to press by about the 15th of February. So it's a pretty quick wrap, but we have the Naval Review, we have the Marine Corps Review, the Coast Guard Review, the Merchant Marine Review, and also Naval Aviation and weapons procurement. And so do one of you want to jump on one of those review sections and just kind of hit the highlights?
Sure. I worked with Wes Hammond and John Quinn, both retired lieutenant colonels, on the Marine Corps Review. Wes has been doing it for us for a very long time. I shouldn't say very long. It'll make him feel the wrong side of whatever age he is. The last year, a lot of stuff happened in the Marine Corps, and they cover it pretty well. But as you can see from the header there, the first subhead in it, the future is subject to debate. One of the big things that they touched on in 2022 was criticism from mostly without the Marine Corps about Force Design 2030. I hesitated on the word without because a lot of it came from retired senior people, retired fans of the Marine Corps, people who felt that it was best to take their grievances public for whatever reason. Some of the criticism was very thoughtful. Some of it was very constructive criticism. It was things that, could be better about this. But they also talked a lot about what General Berger has done, which is not simply say, this is what the Marine Corps needs to be. He said to McWill, the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab, go test this. Go tell me what it should work. One of the things I learned from reading Trent Hone's book, Learning War, was that Admiral Nimitz actually invented the Combat Information Center. He instructed the Pacific Fleet to create this thing, and he described what it would do. And then he told them, go figure it out. That's kind of what General Berger has done here. He said, I have a vision for what I think the Marine Corps needs to be to fight. And it's still 75% what it's been for a long time in most ways, with some changes, but mostly the same. And then 25% is Marine littoral regiments and things like that. So our authors really, they spent their time talking about starting with the criticism, then kind of going through the events of the year, particularly the standing up of the Marine littoral regiments, or the 3rd Marine Littoral Regiment, and the plans for the others, and other changes going on within the service. But it's a nice mix of what happened and what it means. And that's, as you said, one of the things we've done with the change is emphasize a little bit more with the authors. We want a little more analysis. We want a little more what it means, because they can get what happened from USNI News. They can get it from other sources, but our experts give them the context.
Yeah, 100%. Bill, you were the editor for the Naval Review section, and I found that one interesting this year because the authors really delved heavily into, the sort of the programmatic, the procurement progress that the Navy's made this year. So that was the emphasis of of what they really analyzed in large part, with less of the, here this carrier strike group went here and this exercise happened. It was big on how's the Navy doing in its modernization effort. What are some of the key highlights?
Yeah, well, that's right. First of all, this year we had a different author on it. We had Rob Holzer, who's done it since 2011, I believe, and Dmitry Filipov, who is the editor-in-chief of SimSec, jumped on as a co-author, and he replaced Dr. Scott Truver, who had done it since 1994. So Scott Truver did the Navy in Review for almost 30 years, 28 years. And it was time for him to step down and take a knee on it. But we owe him all the Proceedings family owe him a debt of gratitude for all those years of doing it. It is mostly an article about shipbuilding, recapitalization, where the Navy's going, and it's not about what this ARG did on this date in this part of the world, that sort of thing. I think one of the first big point that Dmitry and Rob make is that contrary to some of the gloom and doom you hear constantly about how the Navy's got everything screwed up, can't find its way out of a paper bag when it comes to shipbuilding. The shipbuilding account, and Congress has increased the shipbuilding account pretty significantly over the last 4 or 5 years. Now, some of that is because of the cost of the Columbia class is part of that, but they actually are putting more money into shipbuilding. Whether it's enough, probably not. Are there enough shipyards working? Probably not. Does it take too long to get ships built? Yes. Do they run over? Are they over cost? Generally, yes. Not always, but it's still not as bad a story as people may think.
The way you tell it there, Bill, it sounds like that joke about Wagner's music. It's not as bad as it sounds.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't. Yeah, well, I think Wagner's pretty good, but so shipbuilding is growing. The Virginia class is coming along with the Virginia payload module, which will be the first on the Arizona, I believe. SSN 803, the first U.S. ship to bear the name Arizona since the battleship Arizona, which was obviously sunk at Pearl Harbor and is still there as a memorial. The Columbia class SSBN is the first. They did the steel cutting on the first boat, which is the District of Columbia. So the Columbia class is still called the Columbia class, but the first boat is the USS District of Columbia. And they talk a little bit about the Block 5 Tomahawk, which is pretty cool for those who have followed the story and the history of the Tomahawk missile, which goes back to the 70s, and how it's evolved over time. It's got a cool anti-ship variant that's coming out, and CWIP Block 3, which is a huge increase in electronic warfare capability for the Flight 3 Burks, and they explain pretty well in the article what a really massive modification of the superstructure this takes to put this in. And that the Flight 3 Burks are essentially, after this, kind of tapped out on how much they can have on that hull. You can't put too much more on it.
Space weight and power, right, are kind of tapped out on that, which is why the Navy's talking about DDG next, or DDGX, whatever they're going to call the next surface combatant.
Yeah, and finally, they touch on the Ford class. Finally, doing a deployment, sort of a short deployment, the light, but it's operational. The USS Gerald R. Ford, and they're starting to build the Constellation class frigates out in Wisconsin. So they're coming, and finally, I guess the Zumwalt DDGs, the Navy decided we have a purpose for this, and it's called hypersonic. And so the first Zumwalt made a deployment. It was actually the second hull, I think, the Michael Mansour, but that's what they're going to be used for, kind of high-end hypersonic warfare.
Yeah, no, it's good piece. And as you mentioned, Scott Truver, huge thanks from the Naval Institute for 30 years of doing that, and to Rob and to Dimitri, great work on this year's review. I wanted to highlight the Merchant Marine and World Maritime Review written by Shashi Kumar. I think this is his 11th or 12th year that he's been doing this one. And I like this section every year because a lot of folks in the Sea Service, I was included in this, we tend to focus on the military aspects of the sea, on naval power, power projection, that sort of thing, and not so much on the commercial aspects, which, as Nick Lambert pointed out a couple of years ago in his American Sea Power article, was really the main highlight or the main focal point of Alfred Thayer Mahan's thinking and writing. It's the maritime industry. Shashi is a master mariner, a professor of maritime industry and logistics. So if you only have time in your year to read one article on the maritime industry, the Maritime Merchant Marine Review, World Maritime Review is the one I would recommend. The big story for this past year, 2022, was the story of grain shipments out of the Black Sea, which, as Shashi points out, prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, was 137,000 tons per day. So a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier is a little over 100,000 tons. And I had to check. I actually asked the editor, Jenny, who was working on this one, to double check that figure, because when you think of 137,000 tons per day, that's a lot of grain being moved out of grain elevators onto bulk cargo ships and through the Turkish Straits. But it was 137,000 tons pre-invasion, and it went to zero. And a lot of that grain shipment, a lot of that foodstuffs went to the third world, went to World Food Program, went to to stave off the potential of starvation and famine in a lot of unfortunate countries. Not so much went to the United States, but commodities are global, so it had an impact on food prices. So that was one of the things that impacted the inflation rate here at home and abroad in 2022. And it wasn't until July 22nd, 5 months later, that the Turks worked out this deal between the Ukrainians and the Russians to restart those grain shipments. But 5 months of zero grain coming from the breadbasket, at least of Europe, is a long time to go without grain. So had a big impact. Shashi also points out that 2022 overall was a pretty poor year for the shipping industry. Fuel prices, lube oil prices spiked. Part of that had to do with the embargo on Russian, oil and gas. Also, because of the war, insurance costs were way up, and so because of that, the shipping industry globally just had a pretty tough year. Of course, there are some highlights in and around all economic statistics. For example, the cruise industry started to come back. So people were, traveling again. Airports were crowded, and cruise ships were once again pretty full of bookings. And so cruise ship companies were making a profit or making some money again last year. So anyway, Shashi Kumar does a great job with the Merchant Marine and World Maritime Shipping Review, and I commend it to people every year, because if you're generally focused on the Navy or naval and international sort of security, power projection, military aspects of the sea, you'll learn something every year from reading Shashi's review.
Well, that's Nick Lambert's point in his contribution to the American Sea Power Project. What's a Navy for?
Yeah,
it's all that.
Yeah, right. To protect shipping, or to mangle shipping of your adversary. Right. That's not the word.
It became necessary to mangle the ship in order to save it.
Right. Actually, I think Nick used the word derange to protect shipping, to promote shipping, or to derange shipping of your adversary. But Shashi makes that point pretty clearly every year, that it's all about keeping stuff moving on the high seas, because without it, the global economy just grinds to a halt pretty quickly. Let's talk about the General Prize Essay Contest. So this is also the issue every year where we publish the winners of our General Prize Essay Contest. And so for our listeners, the deadline for the General Prize Contest is always at the end of the year. So this past year was, I think, December 31st. and then we judged them quickly. No, this year it was earlier, right? We moved it earlier to meet this
October
deadline.
31st, I think.
October 31st, and then we read them, we judge them, and then we've got them, the winners picked by early in the year so we can publish them in the March issue. And we judge them in the blind. Top prize winner for the general prize essay is $6,000, with $3,000 for second prize and $2,000 for third prize. And it's always surprising to see who wins. It's very rarely an admiral, and this year the first prize winner was a civilian who'd never written for us before. Who wants to tackle that one?
Well, I edited that one, so I'll jump in on it. Mike Sweeney, I think unintentionally, wrote a nice compliment to the last general prize essay winner, David Allman. As you mentioned, Bill, it's rarely an admiral. In David's case, it was a Air National Guard pilot from Alabama. David last year said, don't buy platforms, buy missiles. You can get more of them out faster. Mike this year said, well, if you're going to buy platforms and you need to fire missiles, these are the platforms that will help, in essence. He was focused on undersea warfare as an opportunity to project power inside the second and first island chains with lower risk than trying to put a DDG well inside China's so-called WEZ, the Weapons Engagement Zone. So it's a smart article. It's an interesting article. I think it's an article some people are going to take exception to in some ways. If you do, I also edit the letters to the editor, comment and discussion at usni.org. So please send your cards and letters, all one word, no punctuation. But I think it's a good opportunity to think again about what a Navy is for, but also how a Navy might execute its mission in the face of someone who has spent years designing a system that is intended to block all the strengths of the U.S. Navy. I don't think there's ever been a circumstance, maybe the Maginot Line, where somebody so deliberately said, this is the adversary, this is how they fight, and this is how we will set up a perimeter that will keep them from fighting. It isn't a generalized defensive line. This will beat the U.S. Navy and nobody else. I mean, it'll beat anybody else too, by virtue of the fact that the U.S. Navy is the biggest and the most capable. But they don't care about Japan's Navy or Korea's Navy, except insofar as they support the U.S. Navy. So Mike's got a smart take on it, an interesting take on it, and it was one of the easiest reads for being so substantive in the whole contest. Sometimes you read through it and you think, wow, I learned a ton, but wow, I put a lot of brain power into learning that ton.
Right.
Mike made it clear to us pretty easily. It was not something where it required tons of red ink to get into shape.
Yeah, I agree. That one, I was thinking of that article also while I was out at West, which was now 3 weeks ago, and the conversation about shipbuilding and about ship maintenance and getting ships through the shipyards quicker, on time, on budget. And one of the admirals, I believe it was the sub-pack commander, but I could be wrong on that. But this theme was echoed was, hey, at any one time, about a third or so of our submarines are in maintenance, an extended maintenance period. And so if we only have, 50 or so, and the number is going down in terms of, before it will start to come back up of, fast attack submarines, that's a problem if this is our key relative strength over the PLA Navy or the PLA military within the first island chain. So, I thought it was just a terrific piece. And, it points to, hey, if you've got a strength, you got to put some, more energy and more budget behind that strength, that relative strength, if you want to capitalize on it.
Probably the most controversial thing in it is that Mike addresses the numbers you just said and says, okay, let's suppose we could even surge most of those that are in the yards right now, which is an optimistic assumption, but even assuming that, and assume you've got subs elsewhere and aren't going to move them from elsewhere, it's a relatively low number. So one of the things he says is maybe what we should do is divert some of the later Columbia class submarines to the SSGNs once we have a sufficient number capable of going to sea as a strategic deterrent. That's going to raise some hackles, I think. There's talk of apparently building a few additional once the initial 12 are done to be intentionally SSGNs. But he thinks with the 4 Ohio class that have been converted to SSGN, that they'll all be retiring in the next few years, that they were kind of at the end of their ballistic missile life when they got the conversion, and they're continuing to go. But without that, the Virginia payload module is good, but it's insufficient. And I'll be interested to see what the readers think about that idea.
Yeah, what's the number comparison in terms of cruise missiles that a Ohio class SSGN can launch somewhere around 150, and or carry 150, and the Virginia payload module is 12, 16. It's a lot less.
So I think if I remember correctly, the first version of the Virginia payload module, which isn't called the Virginia payload module, but is a small plug at the front of the hull, I think has 4 VLS cells. So depending on the missiles, it could do between 4 and 16, although there's nothing I think you'd quad pack in those cells. So it's probably 4 in most cases. I think it's 12 cells, so I'd have to double check that. I don't have that off the top of my head right now. But even if you stick it in every Virginia sub at sea, it's still not the 156 you can get from an Ohio class that's been converted.
Got it. Bill, did you edit one of the GPEC winners, the second or third prize?
No, I mean, I not the primary editor, but I read them all. Aaron Marchant, the Lieutenant Commander Aaron Marchant, wrote the second prize winner. He is a submarine officer and on his way to be an XO. Strategy by Other Means is the title, as you can see there. The gist of this is that the U.S. Navy should be built to serve the foreign policy ends of the United States. And he takes the reader through 4 schools of foreign policy in the U.S. history, starting with Hamiltonian foreign policy, which is really about protecting commerce, and that's the primary purpose of having a navy. Jeffersonian foreign policy, which is essentially that, hey, just a few countries like us can be democracies, and we should just protect ourselves and stay home. And it's a little bit of an isolationist focus at home, focus on the domestic front. Then there's the Jacksonian foreign policy, which quite frankly is a little confusing, and even Marchand says so in the article, that it's on one hand, it's most foreign adventures are a waste of time, treasure, and blood, and we shouldn't get involved in it. But we need to be strong so we can kick some butt when we need to and show everybody we're a really strong nation. Is sort of the sum of the Jacksonian foreign policy, and the last one is the Wilsonian foreign policy, which is more focus on land power and alliance building and sort of thing. So it's very interesting, and there's a lot of great history in it. And his sort of turns around, gets through that part, and is telling us that the Navy needs to be built towards some end. The challenge, and I'll leave this to the reader to decipher, is it takes years to build ships. You have to have a multi-decade at least plan to build ships and construct things, and the American people elect a new administration every 4 years, or at the most 8. And different administrations want to take the country naturally in different directions based on what their mandate is and what their views are. So how you square that circle, I don't know. But that's the gist of the article. It's very interesting, very well written.
Yeah, I took away, I agree with you that it's very difficult to square that circle because, for example, the Ford class carriers that we were talking about a few minutes ago, those ships will last 50, maybe longer than 50 years, right? So that's going to be 6, 8 administrations, maybe. It'll be a long time. And so our U.S. foreign policy goals and objectives will change. over time, despite the fact that we built those ships for whatever we built them for in the year, in the 2020s. But I did, one of the things I appreciated about Commander Marchand's article is that it gives Navy personnel, Navy leaders, a vocabulary, right, that could possibly help them explain to Congress in terms of classical schools of U.S. foreign policy how a particular force structure could apply to whatever Congress and an administration want to do. So, hey, if your foreign policy goals are aligned with a Wilsonian school, this is what a Navy could look like, right? And this is sort of where you should put your priorities. And if you're more Hamiltonian in your thinking, then perhaps it looks like this. I mean, it's big picture. It's definitely a little hand big map kind of piece. But it's instructive and it's interesting and it's very, I think it's well written, and it looks at the world at a strategic level in a way that Lieutenant Commander Hamblet never could have, I'm sure.
Yeah, and it's a thought piece in a sense that there are critics of U.S. foreign policy that become too militarized, and we tend to set the policy based on what we have and what we can do instead of buying and building what we need to achieve some end, and sort of gets backwards in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm mindful of time. We're up here on about 26 minutes. I wanted to talk about a couple more pieces. One, I wanted to mention the American Sea Power article this month is by Elbridge Colby, or Bridge Colby, A Strategy of Denial in the Western Pacific. And Bridge Colby was on the podcast a year ago or so, and he was talking about his book, which is also titled Strategy of Denial. And if you've read Bridge, he's very prominent in military and foreign policy Twitter circles. He speaks a lot. He was the principal author when he was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy of the 2018 National Defense Strategy, which, as I point out in my editor's page this month, is one of probably the most footnoted thing that we've, in terms of footnotes or endnotes that we've run in proceedings for the past 5 years. So many authors refer to that National Defense Strategy because it sets the priorities. But Bridge is basically his piece is, if I had to give an elevator speech about it, is right now, in terms of international security challenges to the United States, the most profound challenge is a growing regional hegemonic China. And if we don't want the world to look like what China wants it to look like, and I think more and more people are coming to the conclusion that China's interests are inimical to the United States interests, that we've got to contain China, deter China, stop China from continuing building its regional hegemony, because that regional hegemony will lead to global hegemony if they are successful. And he points to Taiwan being the key link right now in this decade. He talks about the Davidson window of this decade being preeminent. He mentions the capabilities that the Chinese have been building for Taiwan and for the region. And that all the other things that we do with our military power, particularly our naval power, should sort of be de-emphasized, and being able to defend and deny China their goal of taking Taiwan is the most important thing that we need to do now. He's not, as he points out, he's not a military tactician or military technologist, and so he doesn't prescribe a lot of different specific things we ought to be buying. He does mention mining in there. He does mention the combination, both stand-in forces. He mentions the changes that the Marine Corps is making in terms of emphasizing disaggregated expeditionary advanced base operations, stand-in forces, the ability to if not control the sea, at least deny the sea to the Chinese military. But that's our American Sea Power piece this month by Bridge Colby, and I commend it to the reader. Any thoughts from you guys on that one?
Yeah, I mean it's a good piece. And we had Bridge speak at our history conference as well in October. Did a great job. I found the one interesting thing about it is Bridge uses the term dominate a lot in the article that China's trying to dominate Asia. It's a little unclear to me anyway what he means by dominate. It can mean obviously a lot of different things, but I would suggest that it's, and not to put words in Bridges' mouth, but the Chinese Communist Party's number one goal is to stay in power, and it's not a democracy, so they don't have a peaceful transfer of power kind of model, and they they view the world as if countries can imitate them, more the better, their style of government, and at least if countries can accommodate them in a sense that they don't challenge their governing principles or anything like that and deal with them, that's better. So China wants that from especially its near neighbors, and to get that, they need them to rely less on the United States and more on kind of China and bowing to China's preeminence in Asia. There are territorial disputes for real in the South China Sea, particularly, and in the Senkakus, but also, and of course, there's Taiwan, which is a core interest of the Chinese government. So that's what I see. How much military force we need the United States in the Western Pacific on a day-to-day basis to buttress our allies and give them a sense that we're there and we're not going anywhere. I don't know. That's a question for strategists and military thinkers, but it's something that needs to be there. And I think Bridge would say a lot more of our military power needs to be there on a regular basis.
Yeah, he's definitely, he echoes, Bob Work's comments of a little over a year ago about, sort of the, we've been chasing our tail with forward presence, particularly in the CENTCOM area, and Bridges, he sort of he echoes Bob and says, yeah, that forward presence for presence sakes in other places of the world that are less important right now needs to be either zeroed out or really de-emphasized, so that particularly naval power is in the most important place in the world right now, and that is in the Western Pacific. It's interesting for folks that have been paying attention to the American Sea Power Project. One of the things that Bridge is sort of dismissive of Nick Lambert's point, and I don't know that he disagrees with Nick overall, that the goal of naval power is to either protect shipping or to derange your adversary's shipping. But he sort of dismisses that idea that some have said, oh, well, we can handle the China problem by taking care of it at the peripheries. We could do a distant blockade of China. We could impact shipping flows to and from China. And Bridge points out that the Chinese have done a lot of things to sort of bring into question that ability, right? So they've built this, the Brick and Road, Belt and Road Initiative. They've got a lot of more direct ties, particularly for POL to Russia. And so the ability to blockade a continental power is, that's not going to be an immediate satisfaction. Telling the Chinese, oh, well, we just stopped all shipping through the Strait of Malacca is probably not going to have the impact that some probably wish it would. So it's interesting to see how these things are kind of playing out. But Bridges' point, although I wouldn't say he dismisses Nick Lambert, but he sort of dismisses him in terms of the right here, right now. It's got to be about a strategy of denial around Taiwan rather than a longer term, yes, we need a free and open, global shipping environment, and the ability to threaten that is what would deter China. He's like, no, that's probably not going to deter China from what it wants. Anyway, I always like to talk about asked and answered. We're running out of time here, but Bill, what do we have for asked and answered this month?
Sure. It's what are or were the best and worst Navy, Coast Guard, and Marine bases and stations and why. It's interesting. So, one of the leading contender was Adak, Alaska, and I can tell you, I'd been to Naval Station Adak, Alaska, briefly in the late '80s. It wasn't as austere. It's just austere for sure, but it wasn't as austere as the picture in the article shows, which is from the late '40s when sailors were living in Quonset huts as Adak was being put together after the Second World War. So there's some other interesting, both good and bad. Naval Air Station QB Point was one of a fan favorite of many. I've been there many times when it was open, and it was all true. It was a great base, great O Club, one of the best O Clubs in the Western Pacific, probably. One interesting one was a Coast Guard veteran wrote to us that the Scotch Cap Light Station on Unimak Island, Alaska, which is even further west on the Aleutian chain from Adak, was the worst place he'd ever served, and you were resupplied aperiodically by a buoy tender that brought supplies to the island. So for all the people who get out there who hate it when they can't get a good Wi-Fi signal, or their hotel room doesn't have 97 cable channels that they like. These are some of the places that our predecessors have served that are either good or bad.
Yeah, there's some funny stories there, and I agree that I can't imagine living, being stationed at a lighthouse at the very tip of the Aleutian Islands, and talk about remote and isolated, much closer to Russia than to the Alaskan mainland or to the west coast of the United States. Hey, a viewer just popped a question. Digital Formosan just asked a question, and we're not going to have time to tackle this one because it's a big question. This is a $10,000 question. But do you think the U.S. Navy is prepared if the PLA starts a nuclear strike for dominance in the South China Sea? We actually are working on an article right now. We'll be having our monthly editorial board. One of the articles that is in consideration right now for an upcoming issue of the American Sea Power Project is on nuclear force posture, and the author argues that the U.S. sort of got away from thinking about nuclear weapons in any other context other than sort of mutually assured destruction at the very highest level, at the strategic level. And that the Chinese are now modernizing and rapidly building up their nuclear force posture. I'm not sure how much of that is dedicated towards tactical nuclear weapons, but this is an issue that people are starting to think about again. It's not just about deterring ICBMs and deterring that with an overwhelming counterforce strike. And counter value strike, but starting to think about what does an escalation ladder mean, and what does that escalation ladder mean if there are tactical nuclear weapons, and what do you think about your adversary potentially escalating to using tactical nuclear weapons? So that's a complicated one. We could write PhDs on it, but thank you for asking the question, and stay tuned to Proceedings in the coming months, because we're probably going to have some articles on that topic, at least one article coming up in the American Sea Power Project later this year. And you guys have any thoughts on that?
I just wanted to note, I got curious when I read this one about China's nuclear buildup, which I was kind of aware of, but got me curious this time. And most of their uranium for these is coming from two major U.S. allies, which is, I don't want to uranium shame any of our allies, but sort of a curious thing to me that we'd be condoning China's buildup and profiting from it in the wider sense of within the West. It's like Lenin's line about the capitalists will sell us the rope with which we'll hang them. Anyway, it's an interesting piece, and maybe it does get to that question just a little bit.
Yeah, I would say that to Digital Formosan that I don't know. My personal feeling on this is that the PLA would not start a nuclear strike for the dominance in the South China Sea. They probably would not start there. The only thing I think that would yield a nuclear escalation from the Chinese at this point would be if they decided to go for Taiwan and it was going badly. That's where you might see them escalate, because it is an issue of strategic national importance and national importance to the survival of the CCP. But that's just my thoughts off the top of my head right now. Bill, anything?
Yeah, the Chinese, I mean, as far as I know, they still have no first use policy. Doesn't mean they won't adhere to it, but so I don't, I have a hard time seeing them using that in the South China Sea for, I'm not sure what they're striking and what the point is, but it'd be more interesting to think that would they consider it if they were decided to take Taiwan by force and to preempt U.S. Navy involvement.
Yeah. We're about out of time here. I saw Harry Lime, who's one of our frequent listeners. He popped a question in. Do you think the refit of destroyers, so that's the Zumwalt class, with hypersonic missiles will make them useful? I think the answer is yes, based on conversations I've had with both a prior CEO of one of those destroyers. So the former CEO of the Michael Mansour is the former chairman of our editorial board, and also a conversation I had with Vice Admiral Kitchener, Surface Forces Commander, who mentioned that upgrade project, and he mentioned the Mansour's deployment and what they learned from that deployment in terms of the capabilities, particularly the stealth capabilities of that platform. So I'm thinking that the combination of that very stealthy platform with hypersonic weapons on board will make it, a tactically and operationally significant platform. And with that, we're about out of time. That wraps up another episode of the podcast, brought to you by the members of the Naval Institute since 1873, bringing an independent, open forum for the advancement of sea power. To become a member, go to usni.org/join. If you enjoy the show, ring the bell, subscribe to the channel, tell your friends, and until next week, remember, victory begins at the Naval Institute.